Hey guys, tonight we begin not with a philosopher, an emperor, or a forgotten queen, but with a road. A brutal, dusty, sometimes deadly road stretching over 2,000 miles through the American wilderness. A road that lured pioneers westward with promises of land and glory, and delivered dysentery, starvation, and broken wagon wheels instead. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, you've decided to go west. Bold choice. You've said goodbye to your house, your neighbours, and the idea of indoor plumbing. You're going to Oregon, land of opportunity, fertile soil, and death by river crossing. But first, you've got to pack. And packing a wagon is not like packing for a weekend trip to the lake. This isn't, did I forget my toothbrush? This is, will forgetting one axle pin result in my entire family starving in the Rockies? Kind of stress. Your wagon is roughly the size of a modern minivan, without suspension, insulation, or brakes. It's made of creaky wood and wishful thinking, covered by a canvas tarp that leaks at the worst possible moment. Into this glorified rolling coffin, you must fit 6 months' worth of supplies: food, water, clothing, bedding, tools, spare parts, medicine, a barrel of lard, your 5 children, and somehow your wife's piano. Spoiler, the piano doesn't make it past Kansas. You're already arguing. Do you really need 2 crates of flour? Yes. Do you really need the cradle? Probably not. What about books? Absolutely not. The rule of the trail is brutal. If it's not edible or fixable, you'll ditch it in a panic the first time the wagon tips. Meanwhile, your oxen, the real MVPs of this whole operation, are looking at you like you're the dumbest creature to ever hold a whip. They're half-trained, smell like damp hay and judgment, and they've already stepped on your foot. Twice. Your children are restless. Your wife is furious that you packed the chamber pot upside down. The neighbours are all watching, pretending to wave goodbye, secretly wondering if they can scavenge your wagon once you inevitably turn back or perish in Wyoming. And then the wheel breaks. You haven't moved an inch. It's day 0, and already you're bleeding from a splinter, drenched in sweat, and questioning whether manifest destiny was worth all this hassle. If you're this exhausted before you've even left Independence, Missouri, just wait until you meet your first thunderstorm on the prairie. So, you thought you'd be sitting in the wagon like some frontier king, bouncing gently across the prairie while the oxen did all the work. Think again. The reality hits about an hour after you finally leave Independence. Riding inside the wagon is a luxury, and a miserable one at that. It's cramped, stuffy, and every bump sends your spine into a brief, spiritual crisis. Inside, it's a mix of clanging cookware, swaying barrels, and the unmistakable aroma of unwashed feet and salted pork. Also, the children are fighting over a potato. Again. So, you get out and walk. Everyone does. Because the wagon is already overloaded, and riding in it will break the wheels faster than dysentery takes your neighbour. The trail stretches endlessly ahead, rutted, dry, and unforgiving. Dust rises with every footstep, coating your boots, your clothes, your throat. It gets in your eyes. It gets in your teeth. You taste dirt more than you taste your breakfast. Your shoes, lovingly crafted by a man in St. Louis who swore they were journey-ready, begin to betray you by mile 5. The leather rubs your heels raw. You get blisters. You keep walking. Because what are you going to do? Not go to Oregon? You walk beside the wagon, past oxen with dead eyes and swishing tails. You dodge dung piles like landmines. You stop only to push the wagon out of a rut or refill your canteen with slightly green water from a questionable stream. And it's hot. The sun doesn't care about your dreams. It scorches your neck, your scalp, your spirit. You sweat through your linen shirt and develop a smell that frightens the chickens. Meanwhile, you try to keep pace with a creature that moves like it's been personally offended by your existence. By midday, your legs ache, your socks are soaked, and someone announces that you've made it. 7 miles. You collapse on a rock, gasping, while someone cheerfully reminds you, only 2,000 more to go. Welcome to the Oregon Trail. You thought it was a road trip. It's actually cardio in hell. Morning breaks on the trail like a slap. You slept on the ground with a rock for a pillow and something suspiciously squishy under your blanket, probably a beetle. Your back is a road map of aches. Your mouth tastes like wagon grease. And now it's time for breakfast. If you imagined sizzling bacon and eggs over a crackling fire, bless your romantic heart. Reality serves up something closer to a punishment. You get a dented tin plate, a lukewarm scoop of yesterday's beans, and a biscuit that could legally qualify as a building material. The beans are cold. The biscuit is hard. The vibe? Desperation garnished with soot. There's no coffee. Let's be clear about that. Coffee is for people with money, storage space, and hope. What you get is brown water, vaguely warm, filtered through a scrap of cloth that once dried your oxen. It tastes like dirt and dreams deferred. Still, you gulp it down because the alternative is dying of thirst or drinking from that stream upstream of the dead mule. Someone tries to cheer you up by adding a spoonful of molasses to the beans. It helps, if only slightly. Mostly, it just makes the beans sticky and harder to clean off your fingers. The good news? Your hands are already filthy, so what's one more layer of shame? You eat sitting on an overturned bucket while watching your oxen chew cud like they know something you don't. A nearby wagon family argues over whether they should ration the salt pork or just eat it all now and die full. Grandma votes for the latter. There's a grim silence between bites. Then the flatulence begins. Salted beans and boiled regret don't digest quietly. A small child begins to cry. Another asks if sugar exists in Oregon. You lie and say yes. Cleanup is just as glamorous. You scrape your plate clean with a stick, rinse it with warm spit or a precious drop of water, and toss it back in the wagon next to the pickled cabbage jar you now deeply resent. And that was the good meal. Lunch, hope, dinner. If you're lucky, slightly warmer regret. So you thought you'd be travelling with noble steeds galloping across the plains, your hair flowing in the wind like some 19th century action hero. Instead you got oxen. 4 of them. Thick-necked, slow-hoofed, and about as graceful as a wardrobe on legs. These creatures aren't here to inspire poetry. They're here to drag your 1,600-pound death wagon across 2,000 miles of rutted misery. And they're not thrilled about it. You named them something cute when you started. Buttercup, Clover, Chestnut, and Hank. Now, they go by their true names. Stubborn, flatulent, mostly useless, and Hank, still a jerk. Oxen don't move quickly, or at all if they're not in the mood, and they're rarely in the mood. They stand there chewing slowly, staring into space like they're contemplating the futility of life. You yell, they blink, you wave a stick, they fart. Sometimes they move, but only after you've started walking away in despair. They also don't steer well. They like to wander, usually toward poison plants, wasp nests, or steep drop-offs. It's like their internal compass points toward chaos. You try to correct them, but the yoke's twisted, the reins are frayed, and your patience died somewhere back near mile 2. And they're loud, mooing, snorting, groaning. It's like travelling with a quartet of bored trombones. At night you tie them to a tree and pray they don't wander off, tip the wagon, or plot against you in the moonlight. But here's the kicker. You need them. Desperately. Because you're not pulling the wagon. Neither is your 8-year-old son, no matter how enthusiastic he was back in Missouri. Without the oxen, your journey ends right there. So you feed them, brush them, and apologize after yelling, even though deep down, you suspect they enjoy your suffering. And when one goes lame, because of course it does, you limp onward, dragging everything a little slower, a little sadder, praying the next trading post has a spare. They say pioneers respected their animals. That's true. But it was a respect built on fear, sweat, and knowing that Hank could end your life by simply refusing to move. It happened sooner than you expected. One moment you're trotting along at your usual 1.5 miles per hour, humming a tune to keep yourself from crying, and the next, crack. Something snaps. Loudly, dramatically. Like the wagon itself just gave up on life. Everyone stops. You look around. The oxen are still chewing like nothing happened. The children are digging in the dirt for a pretend picnic. But you know, deep in your soul, you know. Something important is broken. Maybe it's the axle. That cursed wooden bar that somehow holds your entire future together. Or maybe it's the tongue, the long beam connecting your wagon to the oxen, which now lies in two pitiful pieces like a snapped bone. Either way, you're stranded. And it's day 3. You dig through your supplies for tools. You packed spare parts, right? Or did you trade the replacement wheel for a sack of apples back in Independence? Those apples are long gone now, eaten and mourned. You find a hammer, a bent nail, and what might be a butter churn lid. None of these help. There's no mechanic, no emergency hotline. Your nearest help is 30 miles behind you, and he's also missing a wheel. You consider using a tree branch as a makeshift fix. It works for about 12 feet. Then the whole wagon lurches sideways like a dying elk and drops half your flour barrel into the road. Flour. Gone. Floating in the breeze like snowy disappointment. The rest of the party, because yes, you're travelling with others, watches politely, pretending not to judge you, but absolutely judging you. One of them whispers, "Rookie," under their breath. Another offers help in the most condescending tone imaginable. You smile through your teeth and tell them you're figuring it out. Spoiler, you are not. By the end of the day, you've spent 6 hours whittling a splint out of firewood, lost a day's worth of progress, and learned that wagon parts were apparently made of glass and betrayal. You finally get moving again, a little slower, a little shakier, and then someone says, "Hey, where's the water barrel?" You left it behind. Of course you did. You've made it to your first river crossing. It's wide. It's muddy. It's moving fast enough to make you question every decision you've ever made. On the other side, more trail, more misery. In between, your worst nightmare disguised as water. There's no bridge. Of course not. This is 1845, not a weekend hike. You have 3 options: ford it, float it, or pray really hard and try both. Option 1. Ford the river. Drive the wagon straight through like you're some kind of frontier Aquaman. The water is waist deep, the current is strong, and the bottom is a mystery. Rocks? Maybe. Holes? Definitely. Eel monsters? Emotionally, yes. Option 2. Cork the wagon and float. This involves coating the bottom of your wooden wagon with pitch or tar, then convincing yourself that this will somehow turn it into a boat. You pile your terrified children into it, load up your food barrels, and push off, hoping it floats and doesn't immediately become an underwater coffin. Option 3. Ferry. If you're lucky enough to be near one, and if you can afford it. Some pioneers paid in silver, others in flour. One guy traded a goat. You traded your goat 2 days ago for a hat. So you ford it. Halfway across, one of the oxen panics and bolts sideways. The wagon tilts, your crates slide, and your barrel of pickled cabbage goes full Titanic. A scream echoes across the riverbank. You don't know if it's from a child, your wife, or your own soul. You make it to the other side, barely, soaked, shivering, and missing one boot. Everything is wet. Your clothes, your gunpowder, your flour, your dignity. A wooden spoon floats past you. It used to be in the soup pot. The pot is gone now. So is the soup. The kids are crying. You're crying. One ox is chewing grass like nothing happened. Another is lying down in what appears to be resignation. You try to light a fire to dry off, but surprise, wet wood doesn't burn. You finally collapse by the soggy wagon wheel, dripping and defeated, just in time to hear someone ask, Wasn't there a ferry half a mile upstream? You knew it was coming. Maybe you even joked about it back in Missouri when everything was still dry, clean, and untainted by horror. You laughed. Ha, dysentery. Just like in the game. But now you're not laughing. You're sweating, trembling, and sprinting desperately toward the nearest bush. Dysentery doesn't arrive politely. It doesn't send a telegram or ask to see your health insurance. It hits fast, like a ghost punch to the intestines. One moment you're walking along, enjoying a chunk of jerky. The next, your gut turns on you with a vengeance that feels personal. At first you think it's just bad beans, or maybe the greenish water from that suspicious stream yesterday. But then your stomach makes a noise so unnatural it silences the entire camp. Even the oxen stare. And then you run. Now there's no toilet on the trail. There's just nature. And shame. You find a spot behind a scrub bush, armed only with a ragged square of cloth and a prayer. Meanwhile, the rest of the party quietly pretends not to notice. But they notice. Oh, they notice. You spend the rest of the day crouched, curled, or clenching, depending on how generous the gods of digestion are feeling. Your wagon keeps moving without you. Your children ask why daddy's walking funny and why mommy smells like vinegar. There are no antibiotics, no Pedialyte, no call a doctor. There's just whiskey, boiled water, and the hope that your body remembers how to function. Sometimes it passes, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you stop walking because your legs are too weak to carry your regrets. You try to stay hydrated, but your canteen leaks and your backup water barrel is currently being used to rinse socks. You ask someone if you should just lie down and wait for the sweet embrace of death. They laugh, but it's not a happy laugh. It's a yeah, me too kind of laugh. By sundown, you've managed to sit upright, just in time for someone else in your wagon party to clutch their stomach and sprint toward your bush. It has begun again. Everyone gets a turn. It's not a question of if, only when. You start the day optimistically, which is your first mistake. The sun is shining, the ground is dry, and for a fleeting moment you think, hey, maybe today won't be so bad. That's when the Oregon Trail gods, those cruel, muddy deities, decide to roll the weather dice. By mid-morning, the sun has transformed into an oppressive furnace. There's no shade, no clouds, and definitely no breeze. You're sweating through your only shirt, which now smells like a gym sock's final moments. Your hat offers minimal protection, mostly from mosquitoes that laugh in your ear while you slap yourself repeatedly. You start shedding layers, first the coat, then the scarf, then the dignity. Then, just as you get comfortable in your sweat-drenched misery, the wind picks up. Within minutes, the temperature drops like a body in the Snake River. You scramble to put everything back on, but everything is either lost, damp, or mysteriously chewed at the edges. Thanks, goat. The clouds roll in, and suddenly the prairie is a horror film. Thunder rumbles like an angry oxen stampede. Rain lashes sideways. Your wagon tarp flaps violently, threatening to take off like a sad, muddy kite. The firewood is soaked. So are your boots, and socks, and sole. Then comes the hail. It doesn't start small. It skips the polite pea-sized intro and jumps straight to grape-sized sky bullets. One hits your shoulder and you consider making a will. Another pings off the coffee pot with a sound so sharp your oxen try to lie down and surrender to nature. Children are screaming. Adults are screaming. A panicked man is chasing his hat across the prairie like it owes him money. You duck under the wagon, clutching a bundle of wet blankets, and wonder if you'll ever feel warmth again. After an hour of ice-based abuse, it stops. The sun comes out. Birds sing. A rainbow appears, mocking you. You emerge from under the wagon looking like a soaked biscuit. Someone hands you a cup of something warm. You take a sip. It's bean water. Again. You nod in silent defeat, because you know what's coming next. Nightfall, when things somehow get worse. Remember back in Independence when you proudly loaded your wagon with sacks of flour, salted pork, beans and dreams. Well, by day, whatever this is, all of it is looking suspicious. You open a barrel of hardtack and discover it has the texture of limestone and the flavour of historical punishment. There's movement, not metaphorical, literal. You close it again and pretend you didn't see anything. The salted pork. You were warned it might last a while. What they didn't tell you is that a while ends faster when the barrel isn't sealed properly, and one of your oxen used it as a scratching post. It's now covered in a fuzzy white coat of despair. You scrape it off. That's just what people did. Scrape and eat, then pray. Your flour is lumpy. Your beans are bugged. Even your sugar smells like it's been places. You shake the coffee tin. Empty. You cry a little. Then there's the water. The once gleaming barrel of fresh water is now a tepid soup of floating twigs, dead flies, and an unidentified blob you don't want to poke. You strain it through a piece of cloth, possibly once a sock, and convince yourself it's clean. It is not. Tonight's dinner is stew. Technically, it's a grey, unidentifiable mixture of mystery beans, questionable pork, and a carrot that's seen some things. The flavour is best described as boiled sadness. You chew slowly, telling yourself it's better than nothing. It isn't. Someone finds a biscuit from day one. It's hard enough to deflect arrows. You break it with a rock. Inside, a small beetle. You name him Larry. Larry is the most nutritious part of your day. Food rotation is a game of edible Russian roulette. You smell everything. Twice. Then eat it anyway, because the only other option is fasting, which isn't a noble spiritual journey. It's just being hungry in a wagon next to someone loudly chewing on pickled cabbage. By the end of the meal, you feel full, but nervous. There's a certain bubbling. You find yourself watching the bushes again. One more day, one more meal, one more reason you probably weren't built for this. You wake up to the sound of sobbing. Not the usual kind. Not a child whining about blisters, or someone groaning over spoiled beans. No, this one's different. Heavy. Final. You step out of the wagon and immediately know someone died last night. Maybe it was Old Man Jenkins, the one who looked like he was being held together by grit and jerky. Or maybe it was the little girl with the cough that wouldn't quit. Or the baby born 3 days ago under the wagon during a thunderstorm. You didn't even know her name. There are no undertakers, no polished caskets, no solemn organ music. Just a shallow grave dug in hard dirt with a spade that's also used to scoop beans. The body is wrapped in a blanket, the least mouldy one available, and lowered in with care, or at least with grim urgency. The preacher in your group, who also doubles as the blacksmith, says a few words. Something about dust and eternity, and the Lord's will. Someone coughs. Someone else mutters about getting a move on. Because the dead don't wait, but neither does the trail. There's no headstone, just a pile of rocks to keep scavengers away. You carve a name into a piece of wood if you have the time. If not, well, they'll be forgotten by the next rainstorm. Sometimes you wonder how many graves you've already passed without knowing. You try not to think about it. You focus on the wheel, the oxen, the miles ahead. You eat lunch with the taste of morning in your mouth. A child asks why Grandma isn't walking today. You lie. Again. At first it shakes you. Then it dulls. Then it becomes part of the routine. Someone dies. You bury them. You move on. Trail statistics tell you this is normal. 1 in 10 never made it. Disease, accidents, childbirth, exhaustion. You were warned. You just didn't think it would be someone you knew. Someone who shared their molasses with you. Someone who helped push your wagon out of the mud. Now they're in the ground, and the trail keeps pulling forward. Grief on the Oregon Trail has no pause button. By now, you've learned that the Oregon Trail is less rugged adventure and more slow-motion breakdown with livestock. But just when you think the worst is behind you, the dysentery, the blisters, the funeral, nature decides to roll out its welcoming committee. First come the coyotes. They howl at night like a middle school flute recital, loud, off-key, and deeply unsettling. At first you think it's wolves. Then someone explains, no, wolves would be quieter. Coyotes want you to know they're laughing at you. Comforting. Then there are the snakes. Oh, the snakes. You roll up your bedding one morning and find a guest curled up in the folds, napping like it paid rent. It's a rattler. You scream. It doesn't. It just flicks its tongue like it's unimpressed by your shrieking and casually slithers off to find a less dramatic pioneer. By midday, you're refilling your canteen when you notice a set of tracks. Not oxen. Not human. Big, clawed, probably bear, could be cougar. Either way, your odds of winning in a fistfight are hovering somewhere between grim and laughable. And let's talk about raccoons. If you thought these fuzzy bandits were cute, you've never had one unzip your food sack with the precision of a surgeon and make off with your last piece of hardtack while staring directly into your soul. One even tried to climb into the wagon at night. You threw a boot at it. It threw it back. But the crowning moment? The skunk. It waddles into camp like it owns the place. You try to shoo it off gently, because you're not insane, but someone thinks loud clapping is a good idea. It isn't. It turns its fluffy rear toward the group and drops the stench equivalent of a full-blown existential crisis. For 3 days, everything, your clothes, your wagon, your soul, smells like vengeance. At this point, the oxen are the only animals you trust, and even they eye you like they're considering mutiny. Wildlife on the Oregon Trail doesn't care about your manifest destiny. It wants your food, your boots, and your dignity, preferably in that order. At some point on the trail, probably around mile 500, you stop noticing how bad everything smells. Not because things improve, but because your brain has raised a white flag and quietly left the building. Let's be honest, you haven't bathed since Missouri. And even then, it was more of a sponge rub with lukewarm water and half a bar of soap that dissolved the second it touched human skin. Now, you're lucky if you get to splash your face with creek water that isn't actively flowing over a dead squirrel. You'd like to change clothes, but the clean ones are buried under 3 crates of flour and a screaming chicken. And even if you could get to them, they're just as filthy. Everything is dusty, sweaty, and vaguely sticky. Your socks have become biohazards. Your boots smell like they're fermenting. And your hair, a crunchy monument to trail dust, grease, and hopelessness. If a bird landed in it, you wouldn't even notice. In fact, it might be comforting to have the company. You've considered washing. You really have. But that would require water. Precious, rationed water. And using it on your body instead of your oxen is seen as borderline treason. You once suggested taking a dip in a stream, only to be reminded that little Jimmy did that and caught creek rash. Jimmy hasn't been the same since. Toothbrushing? Hilarious. You chew on a twig if you remember. Your breath could legally be declared a weapon. You've scared off a raccoon just by yawning. The wagon itself smells like a travelling compost heap. A mix of unwashed humanity, spoiled bacon grease, damp canvas, and whatever is fermenting in the pickled cabbage barrel, which no one has dared open in 3 days. Every night you curl up in that mess, wrapped in a damp blanket that may or may not have mould growing on it, and try to pretend you're still a person. By now no one even comments. Everyone stinks. You pass each other and nod respectfully. Not as friends, but as fellow survivors of the Great Odor War. Cleanliness, like comfort and joy, was something you left behind in Missouri. Somewhere near the middle of nowhere, possibly Nebraska, possibly limbo. It hits you. Why am I doing this? You don't even remember anymore. Was it the promise of free land? Adventure? A cousin in Oregon who wrote 1 letter before disappearing into a logging accident? You stare out at the endless plains, each one looking exactly like the last, and begin to suspect this was less of a journey and more of a slow, dusty mistake. Your back hurts. Your legs ache. Your face feels like it's been sandpapered by the wind, and your oxen, who now openly ignore your commands, look healthier than you do. Your fellow travelers are equally unwell. One guy talks to his wagon wheel now. Your wife hasn't spoken since Kansas except to curse at the firewood. Your children ask if Oregon has real beds and real food, and you answer with the vague confidence of someone who absolutely does not know. You find a flat rock and sit on it, not because you're tired, you are, but because your soul needs a moment to grieve. You used to be someone. You had shoes with soles. You had dreams. Now you have sunburn and a shirt that smells like boiled despair. A tumbleweed rolls past, almost mockingly. You try to journal, but the ink is dried out and your fingers are too sore to grip the pen. So you stare, and think, and regret. Then someone in your group cheerfully shouts, "Only 1,000 more miles to go." You don't respond. You simply lie flat on your back in the dust and make peace with the prairie. A vulture circles overhead. You wave at it. It waves back. Probably. Later, you overhear someone say, "At least the trail builds character." You nod solemnly, then mutter under your breath, "I liked my old character better." By nightfall, you've stopped asking if things will get easier. You now ask if they'll simply stop getting worse. And that's the Oregon Trail mindset, really. Not hope, not determination, but a quiet, dusty form of acceptance. You keep walking, not because you want to, but because going back would mean walking all the way back. By this point, you've stopped functioning like a regular human being. You've gone feral, in a quiet, dusty, extremely dehydrated sort of way. You no longer see the wagon as a tool or a burden. It's your only constant companion. Your home. Your enemy. Your therapist. You catch yourself talking to it. At first, just muttering. "Let's get over this hill, girl." Then full-blown conversations. "No, I don't think the oxen are pulling their weight. Thank you for noticing." If anyone overhears you, they don't mention it. They've started whispering about you in the same tone people use for a horse with a limp. The wagon doesn't judge you. Unlike the rest of your party, it doesn't ask you where the last barrel of flour went. Spoiler, it tipped into a ravine. It doesn't sigh when you burn dinner again. It just creaks reassuringly. You tell yourself that means it understands. You've personalized it now, given it a name, something sturdy, like Clara or Old Maud. You pat it in the mornings. You apologize when a wheel hits a rock too hard. When it groans under a heavy load, you whisper, "I know, girl. I know." One day, someone finds you polishing the axle with your shirt sleeve, murmuring sweet nothings about reinforced dowels. They back away slowly. Probably wise. And it's not just the wagon. You're forming emotional attachments to anything with weight and silence. Your shovel has become a confidant. Your coffee pot is a symbol of hope. The dent in your mess tin, a reminder of that hailstorm in Chapter 8. You treasure it. The trail has peeled away everything unnecessary. Hygiene, modesty, social norms. What's left is you. A few dented cooking supplies, and a wagon that feels more real than half the people you started with. At night, you rest your head against its wooden frame and imagine a life beyond the trail. One with chairs, walls, and meals that don't contain bugs. Maybe Clara the wagon will come with you. Maybe she'll retire beside your cabin, a weathered monument to your shared trauma. Or maybe she'll be firewood. But tonight, she's your best friend. You did it. You've made it to Oregon. You're still standing. Barely. And so is your wagon, though it now makes a noise like a dying whale every time it turns a corner. The oxen have stopped acknowledging your existence entirely. They just stare into the horizon like they've seen too much. After over 2,000 miles of misery, you've arrived at what you were promised was paradise. You expected rolling green valleys, singing birds, and people applauding your heroic arrival. Instead, you get rain. Constant, bone-soaking, soul-eroding rain. The trail finally ends in a clearing that looks more like a swamp than a promised land. The fields are muddy. The trees loom with judgment, and the welcoming committee is just another wagon party, arguing about who gets the driest patch of grass. You squint at your surroundings, waiting for the magical moment to hit, the sense of triumph, fulfillment, purpose, but all you feel is tired and itchy, probably lice. A man hands you a shovel and says, "Welcome, start digging." You think he's joking. He isn't. There's no town, no waiting cottage, no steaming bowl of stew handed to you by a grateful settler. There's just land, wet, wild, unbroken land. Yours, apparently, as long as you can survive on it, build on it, grow things on it, not die on it. You glance at your family. They look like extras from a zombie film, dirty, ragged, sunken-eyed, and emotionally unavailable. The baby is chewing on a rock. No one has the energy to stop her. Your wagon, Clara, shudders one last time and collapses into a defeated pile of timber. You whisper thank you and pretend it wasn't emotional. You realise slowly that this isn't the end of anything. It's just the next chapter of hard work, bad food, unpredictable weather, and oxen-related conflict. But you also realise something else. You made it. Not everyone did. Not everyone could. You're changed, hardened, possibly haunted. But you survived the Oregon Trail. And if you can do that, well, maybe you really can do anything. Except eat another salted bean. You're done with those forever. In the grand theatre of ancient politics, Cleopatra VII of Egypt didn't just play her part, she rewrote the script. Her liaisons with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony are often romanticized, but beneath the surface, these were cold, calculated alliances crafted for survival and dominance. When Cleopatra ascended to the throne of Egypt in 31 BCE, she wasn't alone. She co-ruled with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, as per dynastic tradition. But the young king's advisors quickly moved to sideline her, pushing Cleopatra into exile. Her response wasn't to rally an army or beg for clemency. It was to ally with the most powerful man in the known world. Cleopatra knew that aligning with Rome meant securing her kingdom's future. She had herself smuggled into Julius Caesar's quarters, allegedly rolled inside a carpet. Theatrics aside, she offered Caesar something more valuable than affection: stability in a volatile region and the riches of Egypt's grain and gold. Caesar, embroiled in his own civil war back home, saw the utility. He helped Cleopatra defeat her brother and reinstated her as queen. Soon after, their son Caesarion was born, though never formally recognized by Rome. Years later, Cleopatra repeated the strategy. When Caesar was assassinated, the Roman world fractured. Cleopatra saw another opportunity. She formed a powerful alliance, both political and personal, with Mark Antony, one of Rome's leading triumvirs. With him, she bore 3 children and jointly ruled vast territories stretching from Egypt to Syria. Their union was a direct challenge to Octavian, the future Augustus, who used their relationship as propaganda, painting Cleopatra as a scheming Eastern temptress, corrupting a noble Roman general. The truth was more complex. Cleopatra was using marriage and motherhood as tools of statecraft. She wasn't seducing Roman men for pleasure. She was securing her dynasty's place in a world increasingly dominated by Rome. Her downfall came not from a misstep in love, but from a miscalculation in power. When Antony and Cleopatra were defeated at the Battle of Actium, it wasn't just the end of a romance, it was the collapse of a diplomatic strategy centuries in the making. Cleopatra's life proves that in the ancient world, marriage wasn't about love, it was about leverage. Before Cleopatra wielded marriage like a weapon, another queen had already demonstrated its power: Olympias, mother of Alexander the Great. Born into the ruling house of Epirus, Olympias was married off to King Philip II of Macedon as part of a strategic alliance. On the surface, it was a classic dynastic union. But Olympias wasn't content to be a pawn. She played the long game. Philip II had no shortage of wives. His marriages were almost entirely political, each one crafted to secure loyalty from various tribal regions around Macedon. Olympias stood out, not only because she was the mother of his heir, but because she was fiercely intelligent, deeply religious, and politically astute. She was initiated into the cult of Dionysus, and rumours swirled that she slept with serpents and claimed divine ancestry for her son. When Philip began taking other wives, tensions boiled over. One of his later marriages, to a young Macedonian noblewoman, threatened Olympias's status and Alexander's legitimacy. Olympias was exiled, and Alexander distanced himself from court life. But then came the shocking assassination of Philip at his daughter's wedding, a killing many believed Olympias orchestrated. With Philip dead, she returned to court not as a widow, but as a queen regent. Her son, Alexander, became king at just 20. While he was off conquering Persia, Olympias stayed behind, fiercely protecting his throne. She eliminated political threats, outmaneuvered rival factions, and executed anyone who questioned her authority. She wasn't content with ceremonial power. She exercised real, often brutal control. What makes Olympias remarkable is that her marriage wasn't the end of her political journey. It was the beginning. She used her position as Philip's queen to birth a future conqueror, and then manipulated that status to wield power independently. Even after Alexander's death, she continued to scheme, trying to preserve her grandson's inheritance amid the chaos of the successor wars. Ultimately, her enemies caught up with her, and she was executed in a power grab. Still, her legacy endures. Olympias proved that royal women could be more than passive political tokens. In fact, they could be architects of empire. Her story laid the blueprint for queens like Cleopatra, who learned that in the ancient world, power often wore a wedding veil. While Olympias and Cleopatra used marriage to gain or maintain power in volatile regions, Livia Drusilla mastered a different game: long-term imperial influence from within Rome's most powerful family. Her marriage to Octavian, who would become Augustus, Rome's first emperor, was not just a love match. It was a calculated merger of prestige, wealth, and dynastic ambition. Livia was already married and pregnant when she first met Octavian. That didn't stop him. So captivated or strategically motivated was he that he forced a quick divorce from both sides. Livia's husband was exiled, and within months she was married to the future emperor, still visibly pregnant from her previous union. It was the kind of scandal that would have destroyed reputations in the Republic. But the shifting tides of power were already washing away the old rules. Though Livia never bore Augustus a child, their marriage became the axis around which the Julio-Claudian dynasty revolved. Augustus adopted her sons from her first marriage, Tiberius and Drusus, effectively merging two powerful bloodlines. Livia became the ultimate Roman Matrona, poised, pious, and politically connected. But behind the scenes, she was anything but passive. Livia acted as a key advisor to Augustus for decades. Ancient sources hint that she pulled strings quietly but firmly, shaping succession plans, neutralizing rivals, and guiding the empire's internal politics. She was involved in courtly manipulations so subtle they were mistaken for domestic virtue. Tacitus, not one to hold back his cynicism, later accused her of poisoning rivals, including potential heirs, to ensure that her son Tiberius would eventually become emperor. Whether that's true or not is beside the point. What matters is that Roman historians even believed she could have done it. That alone speaks volumes about her power. When Augustus died, he left Livia not only immense wealth, but also political authority. She was granted the title Augusta and worshipped in temples, a privilege typically reserved for deities. Her influence over her son Tiberius was strained and often fraught, but the fact remained. She had helped build an imperial dynasty from within a marriage. Livia's story reveals how Roman women, despite lacking official political office, could wield dynastic power through the institution of marriage. In the empire, alliances weren't forged solely on the battlefield, but in bedrooms, cradles, and bloodlines. Fast forward nearly 8 centuries. and we find ourselves in the court of Charlemagne, king of the Franks and emperor of the Carolingian Empire. Unlike Cleopatra or Livia, Charlemagne didn't use marriage to climb the ladder. He was the ladder. But his handling of marriage alliances, especially when it came to his daughters, reveals a new facet of dynastic control: strategic celibacy. Charlemagne himself married several times and had numerous concubines. Each union was political, a means to cement alliances with powerful Germanic tribes, Lombard kings, or noble Frankish families. But when it came to his daughters, he took a bizarrely possessive approach. Despite living in an age where princesses were routinely traded like diplomatic currency, Charlemagne refused to marry off his daughters to foreign rulers or even local aristocrats. Why? There's no definitive answer. Some scholars argue that Charlemagne feared powerful sons-in-law might become rivals, potentially challenging his rule or disrupting the delicate balance of noble loyalties. Others believe it was a matter of control. By keeping his daughters unmarried, he ensured that all future dynastic decisions would come directly from his line and not be diluted by external influence. But this didn't mean his daughters lived like nuns. In fact, several had long-term lovers or bore children out of wedlock, sometimes even under Charlemagne's roof. Rather than punishing them, he allowed these arrangements to continue quietly, perhaps preferring domestic indiscretion over geopolitical risk. It was a peculiar contradiction: public chastity, private leniency. This policy, however, had consequences. It robbed the Carolingian Empire of potential diplomatic ties at a time when marriage could have quelled border disputes or stabilized regions. More importantly, it placed his daughters in an ambiguous social position, royal by blood, but unofficial by role. Neither queens nor true courtiers, they lived in a kind of gilded purgatory. After Charlemagne's death, his son Louis the Pious reversed the policy, marrying off female relatives to consolidate alliances. But the precedent had been set. Marriage wasn't a given for royal daughters. It was a weapon to be withheld as easily as wielded. Charlemagne's unique strategy showed that withholding marriage could be as politically charged as arranging one. In the politics of royal alliances, even inaction spoke volumes. In the heart of Constantinople, where Roman tradition met Eastern intrigue, marriage alliances took on yet another dimension, blending imperial theology, social mobility, and raw political theatre. No figure illustrates this more vividly than Empress Theodora, the wife of Justinian I. Unlike the royal-born Olympias or the dynastically embedded Livia, Theodora began life far from the marble halls of power. She was the daughter of a bear trainer and, according to some sources, worked as an actress and courtesan, a background that would have disqualified her from marrying into nobility in almost any other empire. But Justinian saw something different in her: intelligence, charisma, and unmatched political savvy. Against enormous resistance from the Byzantine aristocracy, he married her, and she became empress in 527. Theodora's rise wasn't just a personal victory, it was a disruption of the established marriage system. Byzantine emperors were expected to wed noblewomen from prestigious families to secure alliances. By choosing Theodora, Justinian broke with tradition, signalling that his reign would be defined by centralization, reform, and unpredictability. And she didn't disappoint. Once empress, Theodora became Justinian's most trusted advisor. She co-authored laws, influenced religious policy, and even drafted imperial edicts. During the Nika riots, a violent uprising that threatened to topple the regime, it was Theodora who urged Justinian not to flee. Her legendary line, "Purple makes a fine burial shroud," convinced him to stand firm, crush the rebellion, and save the empire. Theodora also championed women's rights, passing laws to protect actresses, outlaw forced prostitution, and improve legal protections for women. Her reforms weren't just moral, they were political. By reshaping the legal status of lower-class women, she expanded her base of support and undermined elite monopolies. Her marriage to Justinian wasn't a traditional alliance between noble houses. It was a partnership of ideals and ambition, yet it had ripple effects across the empire. Aristocrats were outraged, but commoners saw hope. Foreign courts took note of the couple's strength, and their united front made Byzantium appear more stable and formidable. Theodora's story shows how a marriage could not only reflect the political landscape, it could redefine it entirely. In the Byzantine Empire, love and power weren't opposites. They were mutually reinforcing forces of reinvention. Few women in medieval Europe wielded more influence through marriage than Eleanor of Aquitaine. Born in 1122, Eleanor inherited the vast and wealthy Duchy of Aquitaine, making her one of the most desirable heiresses in Europe. But Eleanor wasn't just a passive prize. She used her marriages not only to maintain her own power, but to shape the political geography of France and England for generations. Her first marriage was to Louis VII of France. This was a textbook political alliance. The French crown sought control over Aquitaine, and Eleanor's hand in marriage delivered it, at least temporarily. But the match was a poor one. Louis was devout, rigid, and indecisive. Eleanor was intelligent, independent, and ambitious. They clashed frequently, especially during the disastrous Second Crusade, where Eleanor insisted on leading her own troops and was rumoured to have had an affair with her uncle, Raymond of Antioch. Their marriage was annulled in 1152, officially on grounds of consanguinity, but really because they couldn't stand each other and had produced only daughters. Almost immediately after, Eleanor did something shocking. She married Henry, Duke of Normandy, who would soon become Henry II of England. With one move, she shifted her allegiance and Aquitaine's wealth from France to England, sparking tensions that would fester for centuries. As Queen of England, Eleanor bore 8 children, including Richard the Lionheart and King John. But her influence wasn't confined to childbearing. She actively participated in governance, helped administer territories, and even led a rebellion against Henry when their marriage soured. For 15 years she was imprisoned, proof of her political danger. Upon Henry's death, Eleanor re-emerged as a formidable power broker. She negotiated Richard's release from captivity, arranged dynastic marriages across Europe, and governed England in his absence. Her webs of alliances, carefully spun through both blood and betrothal, extended from Sicily to Castile. Eleanor's marriages weren't merely personal choices or noble duties. They were tectonic shifts in medieval geopolitics. Her unions created and destroyed empires, redefined loyalty, and proved that one woman, properly positioned, could redraw the map of Europe. In Eleanor, the politics of marriage reached a new level, not just in forging empires, but in mastering them. No dynasty perfected the art of political marriage quite like the Habsburgs. From the late Middle Ages into the modern era, this sprawling European family expanded its power not through bloodshed, but by strategically marrying into every royal house worth courting. Their motto might as well have been, "Why fight when you can wed your way to domination?" At the heart of this strategy was Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor, in the late 15th century. His marriage to Mary of Burgundy in 1477 brought the wealthy and rebellious Burgundian territories under Habsburg control, an acquisition that gave his family a foothold in Western Europe and made the French nervous for centuries. But Maximilian's most powerful move was on behalf of his children. His son, Philip the Handsome, married Joanna of Castile, heir to the combined Spanish kingdoms of Aragon and Castile. This union produced Charles V, arguably the most powerful man in 16th century Europe. Charles inherited Spain, the Netherlands, Austria, and parts of Italy, not by conquest, but by virtue of these carefully arranged unions. He even ruled lands in the Americas, all thanks to paperwork, not warfare. The Habsburgs took this strategy to near absurd levels. They were infamous for marrying cousins, nieces, and even uncles to nieces, in a relentless effort to keep power within the family. It worked until it didn't. Generations of inbreeding led to health problems, most famously embodied in Charles II of Spain, who was physically and mentally debilitated due to centuries of narrowed gene pools. Still, the political dividends were undeniable. The Habsburgs controlled thrones in Spain, Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, and even parts of Italy and the New World, all without fielding massive armies. Their empire was held together by rings, not swords. However, the reliance on marital diplomacy came with risks. If a marriage failed to produce heirs, or produced the wrong kind, it could unravel decades of careful planning. Succession crises were frequent, and wars still broke out when rival claimants emerged from within the same bloodline. The Habsburgs demonstrated that marriage wasn't just one tool in the diplomatic toolbox, it was the toolbox. In the early modern world, no bullets flew before betrothals were tried. And for centuries, the Habsburgs proved that wedding bells could echo louder than war drums. Catherine de' Medici didn't just marry into power. She manipulated it with surgical precision during one of Europe's most turbulent eras. Born into the immensely wealthy Medici banking dynasty in 1519, Catherine was married off at 14 to Henry, Duke of Orléans, the future King Henry II of France. The match was arranged to solidify ties between the powerful papacy and the French crown, a classic case of political bookkeeping disguised as matrimony. At first, Catherine seemed sidelined. Her husband openly favoured his mistress, Diane de Poitiers, and for years Catherine failed to produce an heir. But when Henry ascended the throne and eventually died from a jousting accident, everything changed. Catherine became Queen Mother to 3 successive kings: Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III. All were too young or too weak to rule independently, so Catherine did it for them. Amid growing conflict between French Catholics and Huguenot Protestants, Catherine turned to marriage as a political scalpel. Her most controversial move came in 1572, when she orchestrated the marriage of her daughter Marguerite de Valois to the Protestant Prince Henry of Navarre. The goal was to bring peace to a fractured kingdom through a symbolic union. Instead, the marriage detonated one of the bloodiest episodes in French history. Days after the wedding, Catholic mobs unleashed a massacre on Huguenot guests in what became known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. Thousands were slaughtered, and Catherine was accused, then and now, of engineering the entire ambush. Whether she ordered the killings directly remains debated, but she certainly used the marriage to lure Protestant leaders into a vulnerable position. Even after the carnage, Catherine didn't abandon her marriage games. She spent years negotiating more dynastic unions, hoping to balance the power of French noble families and maintain royal control. Through it all, she retained her grip on France, not as a warrior, but as a mother, matchmaker, and manipulator. Catherine de' Medici transformed the royal wedding into a chess move where every bride and groom was a pawn in a broader game. Her legacy is one of brilliance and blood, proof that in the high-stakes world of early modern Europe, a marriage could ignite a war just as easily as it could end one. From Cleopatra to Catherine de' Medici, marriage has been wielded like a sword, sharp, strategic, and often double-edged. Across the ancient and early modern world, royal unions were rarely about love. They were meticulously planned diplomatic maneuvers, designed to consolidate power, forge peace, or outmaneuver rivals. Yet, for all their ceremonial splendour and supposed permanence, these alliances were precarious, their outcomes unpredictable. On the surface, marriage promised stability. Cleopatra's union with Mark Antony, Eleanor of Aquitaine's marriages to French and English kings, or Catherine de' Medici's wedding diplomacy all sought to end conflict through union. But more often than not, these alliances merely delayed inevitable power struggles, or even sparked them. What's striking is the consistency of the method across time and cultures. Whether it was the Macedonians using marriage to bind the fractured Greek world, the Romans fusing noble houses for succession security, or the Habsburgs annexing territory through vows, the logic remained the same. Control the family, and you control the future. But this approach came at a cost, especially for the women involved. Royal daughters were treated less as individuals and more as bargaining chips. Their value measured in dowries, strategic position, and childbearing potential. And yet, some, like Olympias, Theodora, Eleanor, and Catherine, hijacked this very system. They played the game so well that they shifted from being pieces on the board to players moving the pieces. Even so, the system was never foolproof. Marriages failed, heirs died, political tides shifted. What began as a dynastic solution often collapsed into crisis, civil war, or dynastic extinction. The Habsburgs' excessive inbreeding, for example, ultimately weakened the very bloodline they sought to preserve. By the modern era, marriage alliances began to lose their grip on geopolitics. The rise of nationalism, democratic movements, and modern diplomacy reduced the role of matrimony in statecraft. Still, echoes remain in constitutional monarchies, in ceremonial state visits, and in the enduring fascination with royal weddings. The politics of ancient marriage alliances weren't just about affection or appearance. They were about survival. And for centuries, a royal wedding was not just a personal event. It was a declaration of intent, an act of war or peace sealed with a kiss, or more accurately, with a contract and a crown. The story of the Trail of Tears doesn't begin with soldiers and wagons. It begins decades earlier, in the fertile woodlands of the American Southeast, lands that had long been home to the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations. These were not isolated tribes living in ignorance of European ways. They had trade networks, complex governance, agriculture, and diplomacy that had evolved for centuries. By the early 19th century, many of these tribes were actively trying to coexist with the growing United States. Some even adopted European customs, Christianity, formal constitutions, plantation-style agriculture, and the ownership of enslaved people. But none of that mattered. As the population of the United States surged after the War of 1812, so did its hunger for land, especially in the South, where cotton was rapidly becoming king. White settlers, backed by local militias and opportunistic politicians, began encroaching on native land, pushing boundaries with a sense of entitlement cloaked in the ideology of manifest destiny, the belief that Americans had a divine right to expand across the continent. Despite formal treaties that guaranteed native tribes sovereignty over their ancestral lands, those agreements were repeatedly ignored or renegotiated under pressure. Legal battles were fought, and some tribal leaders still hoped that diplomacy might preserve their autonomy. The Cherokee Nation, in particular, took extraordinary steps to defend its rights. They formed a constitutional government, published newspapers, and took their case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court in Worcester versus Georgia, where they won. But the ruling was only as powerful as those who enforced it. President Andrew Jackson famously refused to do so, allegedly saying, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." Meanwhile, violence and harassment against native communities escalated. Militia raids, arson, and forced land seizures became increasingly common. The Southeast was becoming a pressure cooker, and the federal government was preparing the legal and logistical framework for something unprecedented: the systematic removal of entire native populations from their homelands. The seeds of displacement had been sown, not through sudden acts of cruelty, but through decades of policy, prejudice, and calculated neglect. The stage was set, the roads west were being cleared, and the tears had not yet begun to fall, but they would soon, and in unimaginable number. When Andrew Jackson was elected president in 1828, the fate of native nations east of the Mississippi grew grim. Jackson was a war hero, known for his brutal campaigns against the Creek and Seminole during earlier military expeditions. He saw Native American sovereignty as incompatible with American progress, and viewed indigenous peoples not as citizens to be included, but as obstacles to be removed. Jackson wasted little time. In 1830, he signed the Indian Removal Act into law. On paper, it was framed as a voluntary exchange. Tribes would relocate west of the Mississippi River in return for land, money, and government support. But in reality, it was legalized coercion. The law gave Jackson and future presidents the authority to negotiate removal treaties, many of which were signed under duress or by minority tribal factions without broad tribal support. The act passed in Congress by a narrow margin. Many Americans, particularly in the North, opposed it, including figures like Davy Crockett and missionaries who lived among native communities. But in the South, the law was wildly popular. White farmers and speculators were eager to seize the lands of the so-called 5 civilized tribes, especially the fertile territories in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. Georgia wasted no time. Even before the ink dried, the state moved to assert jurisdiction over Cherokee lands, ignoring both federal treaties and Supreme Court rulings that declared such moves unconstitutional. Cherokee leaders continued to resist through legal means, while Jackson's administration quietly encouraged aggressive encroachment. To Jackson and his supporters, removal was seen as a benevolent alternative to extermination or assimilation. He argued that it would save native nations from destruction by moving them beyond the reach of white settlers. But to the tribes it was thinly veiled theft, an act of dispossession under the guise of policy. The Indian Removal Act marked a turning point. It set a legal and moral precedent that would justify years of forced migration, broken treaties, and state-sponsored violence. Under Jackson's leadership, removal was not a hypothetical option. It was a promise, a campaign pledge, and soon, a reality. By pushing through the Indian Removal Act, Jackson transformed an American idea, manifest destiny, into federal law. And for thousands of native families, that law would soon mean uprooted lives, death marches, and the collapse of centuries-old homelands. Faced with mounting pressure to abandon their lands, native tribes responded in diverse and often divided ways. Some attempted to resist through legal and diplomatic channels. Others, overwhelmed by the inevitability of removal and the threat of violence, reluctantly agreed to negotiations they did not believe in. And within many tribes, bitter internal divisions grew between those who supported resistance and those who advocated for compliance. The Cherokee Nation, in particular, became emblematic of this internal struggle. Under the leadership of Principal Chief John Ross, the majority of the Cherokee people remained firmly opposed to removal. Ross was educated, politically savvy, and tireless in his efforts to protect Cherokee sovereignty. He lobbied Congress, appealed to sympathetic Americans, and took the legal battle all the way to the Supreme Court in Worcester versus Georgia, which ruled in favor of the Cherokee. But that victory was hollow. Andrew Jackson and the state of Georgia ignored the ruling, and federal troops refused to enforce it. Meanwhile, a smaller faction within the Cherokee, led by Major Ridge, his son John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot, concluded that removal was inevitable. Fearing total annihilation if they resisted, they signed the Treaty of New Echota in 1835 without the consent of the tribal majority. This treaty ceded all Cherokee lands east of the Mississippi in exchange for land in Indian Territory and financial compensation. For the U.S. government, this provided the legal cover it needed. For the Cherokee people, it was a betrayal. The Treaty of New Echota passed in the U.S. Senate by a single vote, despite widespread protests. John Ross submitted a petition with over 15,000 Cherokee signatures, almost the entire population, opposing the treaty, but it was ignored. The government had what it wanted, a signature on a treaty, however illegitimate. Similar patterns unfolded among the Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole. In many cases, tribal leadership was fractured. Treaties were signed under duress or by unauthorized representatives. Communities were divided between those who hoped to survive by yielding and those who resisted at any cost. By the mid-1830s, the machinery of removal was already grinding forward. What had once been debated in Congress and the courts was now becoming reality. And for many tribes, resistance had failed, not because it lacked courage, but because the weight of American expansionism was too heavy to stop. The first major test of the Indian Removal Act came with the Choctaw Nation. In 1830, the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek was signed. another so-called agreement made under enormous pressure. It ceded over 11 million acres of Choctaw land to the United States in exchange for territory in what is now southeastern Oklahoma. The treaty promised money, supplies, and support for relocation, but the reality was starkly different. In 1831, the Choctaw began their forced exodus. It quickly turned into a humanitarian disaster. There were few wagons, inadequate food, and barely any medical support. The journey, hundreds of miles through swampy, frozen, and hostile terrain, was plagued by disease and starvation. One Choctaw leader called it a trail of tears and death, a phrase that would later define the suffering of all who followed. The government's incompetence and indifference were breathtaking. Contractors hired to transport and feed the Choctaw often failed to deliver, leaving families stranded or dead on the roadside. Heavy rains turned paths into impassable mud, and many died of pneumonia, dysentery, or exposure. It's estimated that over 2,500 Choctaw perished during or shortly after the journey, roughly 20% of those who were relocated. Hot on the heels of the Choctaw came the Creek Nation. They had fought fiercely against removal, and many were dragged west only after violent suppression. In 1832, under intense pressure, the Creek signed the Treaty of Cusseta, ceding their remaining lands in Alabama. While the treaty allowed Creeks to apply for individual land allotments, widespread fraud and settler violence rendered those protections meaningless. Local white settlers invaded Creek territory, burning homes, assaulting families, and claiming property by force. By 1836, the Creek situation exploded into open conflict. The U.S. Army intervened, and thousands of Creek were rounded up at gunpoint. Nearly 15,000 were forcibly marched west to Indian Territory. Conditions mirrored those faced by the Choctaw: no infrastructure, inadequate supplies, and a deadly winter. Thousands died en route, many buried in unmarked graves along the trail. The removals of the Choctaw and Creek sent a chilling message to the remaining tribes. Resistance would be punished, treaties would be ignored, and survival meant suffering. For the U.S. government, these operations were successful. For Native America, they were catastrophic beginnings to what would become one of the darkest chapters in American history. Of all the removals, none is more widely remembered or mourned than that of the Cherokee Nation. Unlike many tribes, the Cherokee had made deliberate efforts to assimilate into American society. They adopted a written constitution, developed a syllabary for their language thanks to Sequoyah, printed bilingual newspapers, and built schools, farms, and even plantations. Their government was modelled on the U.S. system, and many hoped that assimilation would earn them the right to stay on their ancestral lands. But these efforts did not protect them. Despite the Supreme Court's decision in Worcester v. Georgia affirming their sovereignty, the federal government pushed ahead with plans for removal, citing the controversial and unauthorized Treaty of New Echota as justification. By 1838, the patience of President Martin Van Buren and the American public had run out. The U.S. Army, under General Winfield Scott, was ordered to begin the forced removal of the Cherokee. Troops rounded up over 16,000 Cherokee from their homes in Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Alabama. Families were separated. People were herded into stockades like cattle, with barely any notice to collect their belongings. Many died in these makeshift prisons, even before the journey began. The march west, covering more than 1,000 miles, began in the fall of 1838. The Cherokee were forced to travel on foot, often without adequate shoes, clothing, or food. The government failed to provide promised wagons and supplies, and harsh weather, first the summer heat, then winter snow, made the journey hellish. Entire families succumbed to dysentery, pneumonia, and exhaustion. Leaders like Chief John Ross tried desperately to make the journey more humane, negotiating for self-led detachments to allow more flexibility. Even so, thousands perished. The most widely accepted estimates suggest that between 4,000 and 5,000 Cherokee died along the Trail of Tears, nearly a quarter of their entire population. The emotional toll was just as severe. Communities that had lived together for generations were scattered. Sacred sites were left behind. A culture deeply rooted in its homeland was forcibly replanted in unfamiliar soil. The Cherokee removal became the symbol of everything the Trail of Tears represented: broken promises, national betrayal, and the horrific cost of American expansionism. And though it was framed as policy, it was, at its core, a forced death march driven by greed and indifference. Unlike the Choctaw Creek or Cherokee, the Seminole did not go quietly, or entirely at all. Their removal was the bloodiest and most prolonged of all, stretching over several decades and involving 3 brutal wars. The Seminole were a unique people, a fusion of various Native American groups and escaped enslaved Africans who had found refuge in the swamps and hammocks of Florida. That diversity, combined with their guerrilla warfare tactics and deep familiarity with the terrain, made them formidable opponents. After the Treaty of Payne's Landing in 1832, the U.S. government claimed that the Seminole had agreed to relocate. But many Seminole leaders rejected the treaty, arguing it had been signed by a small, unrepresentative group under false pretenses. When American troops arrived to enforce removal, resistance exploded into open warfare. The Second Seminole War, which began in 1835, became one of the longest and costliest Indian conflicts in U.S. history. Led by the charismatic and defiant warrior Osceola, the Seminoles struck swiftly from the shadows. They ambushed troops, vanished into the Everglades, and refused to submit. Osceola himself became a symbol of indigenous resistance, eloquent, fearless, and unbroken. But his story ended in betrayal. In 1837, Osceola was captured under a false flag of truce during supposed peace negotiations. He was imprisoned and died of illness shortly after. His capture marked a turning point, but not the end. Fighting continued for years. The government poured millions into the campaign, deploying tens of thousands of troops in an effort to root out the resistance. Ultimately, thousands of Seminole were killed or forcibly removed, sent to Indian Territory in Oklahoma. Yet some held on. A small number of Seminole families never surrendered, retreating deeper into the Florida wilderness. Their descendants remain in Florida to this day, proud of being the only major tribe that never signed a formal surrender treaty. The Seminole resistance challenged the narrative that native removal was inevitable or orderly. It exposed the cruelty of the government's tactics and the resilience of a people who chose defiance over submission. Where others walked the Trail of Tears, the Seminole dug in, fought back, and left a legacy of resistance that echoes across American history as a rare but powerful refusal to be erased. By the early 1840s, most of the forcibly removed tribes had completed their harrowing journeys to Indian Territory, an expanse of land in what is now Oklahoma, set aside by the U.S. government as a supposed permanent home for Native Americans. But even after the trauma of removal, their suffering was far from over. Life in Indian Territory was brutal, unfamiliar, and fraught with new challenges. The land was rough, untamed, and often unsuitable for farming. Tribes had to start over from scratch, rebuilding homes, communities, schools, and governments. Some arrived during harsh winters with little shelter. Others faced droughts, failed crops, or outbreaks of disease. The promised supplies, tools, and financial compensation from the U.S. government were frequently delayed, mishandled, or stolen by corrupt Indian agents. Starvation and illness were common in the early years. The psychological toll was equally severe. Communities that had lived for generations in tightly knit villages were scattered. Ceremonial grounds, sacred rivers, and burial sites had been left behind. Entire cultures were uprooted and forced to adapt to new conditions under constant federal surveillance. And yet, resilience persisted. The Cherokee rebuilt their government and re-established their school system. The Choctaw drafted a constitution. The Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole worked to preserve their traditions while adapting to a landscape never meant to be theirs. These efforts were acts of defiance, proof that cultural annihilation had not succeeded. Still, tensions bubbled beneath the surface. The divisions sown by forced treaties, especially among the Cherokee, lingered. Supporters of the Treaty of New Echota, like Major Ridge and Elias Boudinot, were assassinated by fellow Cherokee who viewed them as traitors. Grudges festered, and rival factions disrupted tribal unity. Moreover, Indian territory was never truly safe. White settlers and land speculators continued to push the boundaries, hungry for more territory. The federal government began renegotiating new treaties, demanding further land cessions and opening the door for railroads, missionaries, and commerce. The so-called permanent Indian frontier proved anything but. Life in Indian territory was meant to be a solution, a final settlement where native tribes could live in peace. Instead, it became another phase in a long, painful saga of broken promises. The tribes had been marched west to make room for America. Now, even here, they were still in its way. The Trail of Tears did more than relocate thousands. It reshaped the soul of a nation. For the Native American tribes who survived, it marked the beginning of a long exile, not just from their homelands, but from the promises, rights, and recognition they were told they would receive. For the United States, it became a symbol, sometimes proudly, sometimes shamefully, of the nation's willingness to sacrifice justice for expansion. The betrayal wasn't just one moment. It was systemic. Treaties were made and broken with astonishing regularity. The Indian Removal Act had promised lands in perpetuity, yet within decades, even those lands were being taken. In the late 19th century, the Dawes Act would divide tribal lands into individual plots, opening up more territory for white settlers and further undermining communal sovereignty. The loss wasn't just physical. It was cultural, spiritual, generational. Oral traditions were interrupted, languages threatened, and traditional governance systems eroded. Yet for all the damage inflicted, native identity endured. The forced removals became a point of mourning, but also a rallying cry for resistance, remembrance, and eventual resurgence. In the broader American consciousness, the Trail of Tears was long neglected or softened in schoolbooks and public memory. It was often portrayed as a sad but necessary step in building a great nation. Only in the late 20th century did wider public reckoning begin. Monuments were erected, historical trails marked, and official apologies issued. In 1987, the U.S. Congress designated the Trail of Tears National Historic Trail, recognizing the path of suffering taken by the Cherokee and other tribes. But no memorial can reverse what was lost. Generations of pain echo in the names of those who died along the trail, in the stolen futures of entire communities. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole were not defeated. They were betrayed. Their survival is not a product of U.S. mercy, but of their own resilience. The Trail of Tears is not ancient history. Its consequences shape native life today, in struggles over land, sovereignty, education, and justice. The legacy of betrayal has not faded, but neither has the determination of the people who walked it. They endured more than relocation, they endured erasure, and still they remember. Still they remain. Today, the Trail of Tears stands as both a historical scar and a symbol of unbreakable endurance. It is remembered not only for its brutality, but for the strength of those who survived it, and the descendants who carry that legacy forward. Across the United States, efforts to preserve the memory of this forced removal have grown, though the full weight of its impact is still not always fully acknowledged. In communities across Oklahoma and the Southeast, annual remembrance events, educational programs, and reenactments serve to honor those who were displaced or perished. The Trail of Tears. National Historic Trail now spans thousands of miles across multiple states, with interpretive centers, memorials, and preserved paths marking the route. But while plaques and monuments can offer solemn reflection, they cannot substitute for justice or restoration. For Native communities, remembering is not passive, it's an act of cultural survival. Tribal nations like the Cherokee and Choctaw have developed robust programs to teach their histories, revive languages, and reconnect with traditional practices that were nearly lost during and after removal. Storytelling, song, and ceremony play vital roles in passing these experiences down, ensuring the Trail of Tears is not forgotten as mere policy. It is remembered as lived trauma and ongoing resistance. Yet reckoning also requires confronting broader American memory. For many years, textbooks minimized the events, framing removal as an unfortunate but necessary step in progress. Only more recently has the narrative shifted toward truth-telling. Schools, museums, and public institutions are increasingly challenged to tell the full story. Of greed cloaked in law, of democracy corrupted by conquest, and of native peoples cast aside in their own homeland. This reckoning also echoes in modern political battles over land rights, tribal sovereignty, environmental protections, and access to healthcare and education. The consequences of forced removal are still felt in systemic inequities, but so too is the strength that carried nations through the darkest miles of the 1830s. To remember the Trail of Tears is not just to look backward, it's to recognize the living presence of native peoples in America today. It's to honor survival, demand justice, and refuse to let history be rewritten to comfort the powerful. In that sense, every act of remembrance becomes a step forward on the long trail home. In ancient Babylon, justice wasn't just handed down by kings, it was etched in stone for all to see. Around 1754 BCE, King Hammurabi commissioned a towering stele inscribed with what would become one of the earliest and most influential legal codes in human history, the Code of Hammurabi. Standing over 7 feet tall and written in cuneiform script, the black basalt monument was meant to project both order and authority. It didn't just govern, it warned. The Code of Hammurabi contained 282 laws covering everything from trade and family matters to theft and assault. But it wasn't democratic. These laws reflected a rigidly hierarchical society where penalties varied dramatically depending on your social status. For example, if a nobleman broke the bone of another nobleman, the punishment was to have his own bone broken, a clear case of the infamous eye for an eye approach. But if the same nobleman broke the bone of a commoner or a slave, the punishment was merely a fine. Justice in this system was proportional not only to the crime, but to the rank of the person involved. The laws emphasized personal responsibility and state authority. Builders whose poorly constructed homes collapsed and killed the inhabitants could be put to death. Merchants who cheated customers could face mutilation. Even family disputes were tightly regulated, with strict laws governing marriage, inheritance, and parental authority. Adultery, theft, and false accusation were especially harshly punished, often by execution or public shaming. What made the code revolutionary was not just its content, but its visibility. It stood in public spaces, carved with the image of Hammurabi receiving divine authority from Shamash, the sun god and god of justice. This wasn't just a legal document, it was propaganda, reinforcing the idea that Hammurabi ruled by divine right and that his laws were sacred and immutable. However brutal it may seem by modern standards, the Code of Hammurabi established the concept that law should be written, standardized, and accessible. It replaced arbitrary judgment with codified norms. In doing so, it laid the groundwork for later legal systems across the ancient world and continues to fascinate historians, lawyers, and ethicists alike. In Babylon, justice wasn't blind. It was watching, and it had a chisel. In ancient Egypt, justice wasn't just a legal concept, it was a cosmic force. The Egyptians believed in Ma'at, a divine principle embodying truth, balance, and moral order. More than just a goddess, Ma'at represented the foundation of the universe itself. Pharaohs ruled not just with power, but with the responsibility to uphold Ma'at. In doing so, they maintained harmony between gods, nature, and society. Unlike the codified laws of Babylon, Egyptian justice was more flexible and case-specific. There was no singular legal code chiseled into stone. Instead, judges, often high officials or priests, interpreted Ma'at in their rulings. While this allowed for context-sensitive decisions, it also meant that justice could be highly subjective and dependent on the social standing of those involved. Court proceedings were both formal and performative. Cases could be tried before local officials or higher courts in the royal bureaucracy, depending on the severity. Plaintiffs and defendants presented their versions of events, and witnesses were essential. Written records, contracts, testimonies, and petitions were maintained on papyrus, a relatively advanced system of documentation for its time. For common offences like theft or assault, punishments could include fines, beatings, or forced labour. More serious crimes, such as tomb robbery or blasphemy, were treated as offences not only against the state, but against the gods. These could lead to execution, sometimes by fire, drowning, or impalement, or even posthumous punishment, like desecration of the corpse to prevent entry into the afterlife. Perhaps the most iconic image of Egyptian justice comes from the Book of the Dead, in which the heart of the deceased is weighed against the feather of Ma'at. If the heart was heavy with wrongdoing, it was devoured by Amit, a crocodile lion hippopotamus monster, and the soul was condemned to oblivion. If it balanced with the feather, the soul was allowed to enter the eternal paradise of the field of reeds. In Egypt, justice was inseparable from spirituality. The courtroom was not just a venue for dispute, it was a sacred space where divine order was upheld. Unlike Babylon's rigid laws, Egyptian justice flowed with the moral tides of Ma'at, rewarding those who lived in harmony with truth and punishing those who disrupted the balance of the cosmos. In ancient Greece, particularly in Athens during the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, justice took on a radically different form from the divine or king-centered systems of Babylon and Egypt. The Greeks began experimenting with something revolutionary, a justice system grounded in citizenship, debate, and public participation. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it laid the foundation for many modern legal concepts. Athenian democracy gave every male citizen the right to participate in the courts, both as a plaintiff or defendant and as a juror. There were no professional judges or lawyers. Instead, massive juries, sometimes hundreds strong, were randomly selected from the population. These jurors were responsible not only for hearing cases, but for deciding verdicts and penalties, all without appeal. Trials were short, often completed in a single day, and each side was allowed a set amount of time to present their case, measured by a water clock called a clepsydra. The types of cases ranged widely. Theft, slander, adultery, assault, property disputes, and even impiety, disrespecting the gods, could be brought to trial. While punishments for minor offences were often fines or exile, more severe crimes could lead to death, particularly in cases involving treason or religious sacrilege. Socrates, for example, was famously sentenced to death for allegedly corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods. Importantly, Greek justice systems did not rely on a written legal code accessible to all. While some laws were inscribed publicly, much of the legal knowledge was held by a small literate elite, meaning outcomes often depended more on rhetoric than on precedent. A clever speaker, or a rich citizen who could hire a skilled orator to speak for them, had a clear advantage. Justice was tied closely to persuasion and performance. Athenians also used a form of preemptive justice called ostracism, in which citizens could vote once a year to exile someone from the city for 10 years. No crime had to be proven, just a consensus that someone had become too dangerous or powerful for the health of the state. Though flawed, ancient Greece introduced the idea that justice could be a collective civic responsibility, not just the decree of a ruler or priest. It was an early and chaotic experiment in legal equality that still echoes in today's courtrooms. In ancient India, justice was rooted in a profound and layered concept called dharma, a term that defies easy translation but roughly means duty, righteousness, and cosmic law. Unlike the law codes of Babylon or the civic trials of Greece, Indian justice was not just about right and wrong, it was about maintaining harmony in the universe, society, and the self. Dharma varied depending on one's age, caste, gender, and stage of life, making justice a deeply contextual and moral affair. The legal framework in ancient India was first formalized in texts known as the Dharma Shastras, with the most well-known being the Manusmriti, or Laws of Manu, compiled around the 2nd century BCE to the 3rd century CE. These texts weren't laws in the modern sense, but spiritual and social guidelines that shaped legal thinking for centuries. They defined everything from property rights and inheritance to marriage, contracts and punishments. The caste system was central to this legal vision. Brahmins, priests, kshatriyas, warriors, vaishyas, merchants, and shudras, labourers, were each subject to different rules and penalties. For instance, a Brahmin committing a certain offence might face a fine or temporary exclusion from rituals, while a Shudra committing the same act could be sentenced to corporal punishment or worse. Justice in this system was not blind. It was hierarchical, deeply tied to one's birth. Despite this, Indian justice was not entirely unforgiving. The concept of intent mattered, as did repentance. A wrongdoer could lessen punishment through penance or charity, and judges were encouraged to consider the moral and spiritual state of the accused. Kings often served as the highest judicial authority, advised by Brahmin scholars and ministers, blending divine law with royal decree. Trials could involve ordeals, especially when evidence was inconclusive. These included holding red-hot iron, walking through fire, or retrieving objects from boiling oil, believed to reveal guilt or innocence based on divine will. Such methods were seen as a last resort, not standard practice. Above all, justice in ancient India aimed to restore cosmic balance. It wasn't just about punishing crime, it was about righting spiritual wrongs, correcting social disorder, and guiding souls back toward Dharma. It was a justice system where morality, religion, and law were inseparable. Across the ancient world, when legal systems hit a wall, when evidence was lacking, witnesses unreliable, or accusations unprovable, societies often turned to the gods to decide. One of the most dramatic and terrifying ways this happened was through trial by ordeal, a practice used in multiple cultures, including Babylon, India, and later medieval Europe. The idea was simple but brutal. If human justice couldn't determine guilt, divine justice would intervene through pain. In Babylon, one common ordeal involved throwing the accused into a river. If they floated or survived, the gods had spared them, and they were declared innocent. If they drowned, guilt was confirmed, though inconveniently, the dead could no longer be punished. This method reflected a deep belief in divine oversight, as water was seen as a sacred and impartial force. In ancient India, as outlined in the Dharma Shastras, multiple forms of ordeal existed. These included walking across hot iron ploughshares, retrieving coins from boiling oil, or surviving exposure to venom. The logic wasn't cruelty, it was divine arbitration. Surviving unharmed or with minimal injury was interpreted as proof of innocence. The gods, it was believed, would not allow the innocent to suffer without cause. Though horrific by modern standards, trial by ordeal wasn't always purely physical. In some cases, it involved oaths taken in sacred spaces. Swearing on a holy object or invoking a deity's wrath was thought to bind the speaker to truth. Lying under such conditions was believed to invite divine punishment, either immediately or in the afterlife. The psychological power of ordeal was immense. It could terrify the guilty into confession and bolster the faithful's belief in cosmic justice. But it also revealed how fragile human legal systems were, how deeply ancient peoples felt the need for something beyond human judgment. Ordeals were usually a last resort, a way to settle cases no one could otherwise resolve. Despite their reliance on supernatural outcomes, ordeals reflected a desire for fairness. They were brutal, yes, but they were also democratic in a strange way. Kings and peasants alike could be subjected to them. In the absence of forensics or due process, suffering became a courtroom, and the gods were expected to serve as judge, jury, and executioner. In ancient Egypt, Justice was not administered by impartial courts or elected juries. It flowed directly from the divine authority of the pharaoh. As both king and living god, the pharaoh was seen as the earthly embodiment of Ma'at, the principle of truth, balance, and cosmic order. This meant that maintaining justice wasn't just a political duty, it was a sacred obligation. The pharaoh had ultimate legal authority. His word could overrule any judgment, command the execution of criminals, pardon the guilty, or rewrite laws at will. This concentration of power was justified not through human logic, but through divine sanction. To disobey the pharaoh was to disrupt the harmony of the universe. But the pharaoh didn't govern alone. A vast bureaucratic system extended across Egypt, from royal officials in the capital to local magistrates in provincial towns. These officials acted as judges, scribes, and investigators. Their decisions were guided by royal edicts and the principles of Ma'at, rather than a formal legal code. Written laws were rare and largely case-based, passed down through precedent and scribal training. Courtrooms varied in size and importance. In local villages, disputes might be handled by a council of elders or temple priests. In major cities, formal judgment halls heard complex cases involving property, theft, assault, and inheritance. Proceedings were recorded in meticulous detail on papyrus scrolls, many of which survive today, giving us a rare window into how ancient Egyptians argued and judged. Trials included elements of both testimony and written evidence. Plaintiffs and defendants gave their accounts, often under oath. Witnesses were called, and physical evidence, when available, was considered. False accusations were taken seriously, and if proven, could result in the accuser receiving the punishment intended for the defendant. Punishments varied widely, from restitution and fines to flogging, forced labour, or execution. Crimes against temples, tombs, or royal property were treated with special severity. Yet, the system also emphasised rehabilitation and compensation. In many cases, wrongdoers were given opportunities to make amends, particularly if they confessed voluntarily. What made Egyptian justice unique was its fusion of absolute monarchy and moral expectation. The pharaoh may have ruled with unchecked power, but he was expected to wield it with fairness. In the eyes of his people and his gods, a just ruler wasn't merely feared. He was revered as the guardian of cosmic balance. While divine kings and priestly classes dominated justice in many ancient civilizations, ancient Greece, particularly democratic Athens, took a dramatically different approach. Justice was no longer the exclusive domain of gods and monarchs. It became a public duty, shared and enacted by citizens through councils and popular assemblies. In Athens, the administration of justice rested primarily with two major institutions: the Ecclesia, the citizen assembly, and the Heliaia, a massive popular court composed of citizen jurors. Rather than being handed down from rulers, law and justice were shaped by everyday male citizens who took turns participating in governance. Laws were proposed and voted on by the assembly, while trials were conducted by large juries, sometimes numbering 500 or more, to prevent bribery or manipulation. There were no judges in the modern sense. Instead, magistrates, selected by lottery or popular vote, organised trials and ensured procedures were followed. However, it was the jurors, drawn randomly from citizens over the age of 30, who decided the verdict. With no appeal process and no deliberation room, verdicts were final, and penalties were voted on directly after guilt was determined. This system favoured persuasive speech over evidence. Defendants and plaintiffs had to represent themselves or hire skilled orators to write speeches on their behalf. Rhetoric was everything, and clever manipulation of public emotions could sway the outcome. While this system promoted civic participation, it also meant that justice could be uneven, less about law and more about persuasion. For certain political matters or threats to the state, special assemblies or councils were convened. One famous mechanism was ostracism. where citizens voted once a year to exile anyone deemed dangerous to democracy. No crime had to be committed, just a public consensus that someone's influence was unhealthy. 10 years in exile, no trial, no defence. Despite its imperfections, the Greek council-based system introduced powerful new ideas. The importance of peer judgment, open debate, and the notion that law belongs to the people. It was messy, emotional, and sometimes unjust. But it was also revolutionary. In Greek justice, the courtroom was a stage, the citizen was the judge, and justice was a public performance. One in which every man had a part to play, and where power was held briefly in the hands of the people themselves. In ancient India, justice extended far beyond courtrooms and punishments. It was interwoven with the concept of karma, the belief that every action carries moral weight and spiritual consequence, both in this life and in the next. Unlike the civic trials of Greece or the royal decrees of Egypt, Indian justice emphasized a cosmic ledger, where no wrongdoing escaped ultimate accountability. Karma wasn't a legal mechanism, it was a moral law embedded in Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist traditions. Good actions led to positive outcomes, while bad actions brought suffering, even if not immediately. A thief might evade human justice, but the universe itself would balance the scales. This belief reinforced ethical behaviour, even in the absence of enforcement. Still, ancient India did have structured legal systems. The Manusmriti and other Dharma-shastras offered guidance not just for courts, but for individual conduct. They outlined specific duties for each caste and role in society, reinforcing that justice was not a one-size-fits-all model. Kings were expected to rule according to Dharma, and failing to do so could bring spiritual as well as political consequences. Buddhism, which emerged in the 5th century BCE, further deepened the karmic view of justice. It rejected caste-based legal inequality and promoted universal moral principles, non-violence, truthfulness, and compassion. While not a legal code, Buddhist ethics influenced rulers like Emperor Ashoka, who in the 3rd century BCE renounced conquest and reformed his empire around Buddhist values. His famous rock edicts speak of mercy, tolerance, and the moral responsibility of governance. Justice, then, was about much more than trial and punishment. It was about inner purity, intention, and spiritual accountability. A person might escape a king's penalty, but not the consequences of their own deeds. Likewise, a king who ruled unjustly was believed to be storing up suffering for himself in future lives. This karmic understanding of justice created a powerful internalized system of order. It was deeply personal, and for many, far more intimidating than any earthly authority. Whether enforced by law or left to the cosmos, Indian civilization viewed justice not merely as retribution, but as a force for restoring harmony between self, society, and the universe itself. Though thousands of years have passed since the rise of Babylon, Egypt, Greece, and India, their justice systems continue to shape how we think about crime, punishment, and fairness today. These ancient civilizations laid the intellectual, moral, and procedural foundations of legal systems that still guide societies across the globe. Babylon gave us the earliest known codified law, the idea that justice should be publicly visible, consistent, and enforced by the state. The principle of an eye for an eye still appears in legal and ethical debates, symbolizing both the call for proportionate punishment and the dangers of retributive excess. Egypt introduced the concept of divine kingship and moral law, where justice was not just social, but cosmic. The emphasis on balance, truth, and harmony echoes in modern ideas of restorative justice, where the goal isn't just to punish, but to restore community equilibrium. Greece revolutionized justice by tying it to citizenship and participation. Trial by jury, public debate, and the notion of peer judgment began in Athens, and remain central to many legal systems today. Though imperfect and exclusionary, Greek democracy planted the seeds for legal systems that value public involvement and accountability. India contributed deeply spiritual and ethical dimensions to justice. The concepts of dharma and karma added a moral backbone to legal systems, encouraging personal responsibility and self-regulation. Even today, Indian law reflects a hybrid system where British legal structures coexist with religious and customary laws, demonstrating the enduring power of ancient traditions. These systems weren't flawless. They were often unjust, classist, patriarchal, and brutal. They privileged the elite, punished the vulnerable, and enforced hierarchies. But they also posed essential questions still relevant today. Who gets to define justice? Is it grounded in divine authority, civic consensus, or moral truth? Should law be equal for all, or adjusted for social role? How do we balance punishment with mercy? Modern law may be more humane and structured, but it carries the DNA of these early systems. We still carve laws into stone, figuratively, expecting them to uphold order. We still debate justice in courts, assemblies, and temples of thought. And we still wrestle with the same eternal tension between power and fairness, law and morality, crime and consequence. In many ways, our pursuit of justice is ancient and ongoing.